Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a massive, fascinating historical mirror. Two giant empires, one shared, tragic path to total collapse. We're looking at the striking structural parallels between the fall of the Western Jin dynasty in China and the Western Roman Empire in Europe. We usually think great empires get toppled by these huge, sweeping foreign invasions, right? But what if the absolute deadliest blows actually come from the inside? Let's trace how this actually goes down.
To really grasp this internal rot, you just have to hear this one chilling quote. Why don't they eat meat porridge instead? Emperor Hui of the Western Jin dynasty actually said this. Just outside his capital of Luoyang, tens of thousands of his own citizens were literally starving to death. Historical records tell us people were eating grass roots, tree bark, and shockingly, even each other. Yet, when someone told the emperor his people had no grain, he was just genuinely confused. It's an unbelievable illustration of a summit of power that was entirely, completely disconnected from reality.
And honestly, that meat porridge comment, it wasn't a one-off. There was this one time Emperor Hui was walking through his imperial gardens and heard frogs croaking in a pond. He stopped and, in all seriousness, asked his eunuchs, are these frogs croaking for the state or for themselves? It's almost a tragicomedy, but it reveals something super dangerous. A ruler totally incapable of basic common sense, let alone running an empire. He was sitting on a throne that desperately needed strong leadership to hold a fragile system together, and it was a system made fragile by a literal ticking time bomb planted by his predecessor.
So how exactly was this bomb planted? Well, the founder of the Jin dynasty, Sima Ying, took power by usurping the previous Cao Wei dynasty, and he took away a very specific lesson from that. If you keep the imperial family weak and unarmed, ambitious outside ministers are just going to steal the throne. So his genius solution was to do the exact opposite. He enfoffed dozens of his own Sima relatives as kings. But here's the massive, fatal flaw. These weren't just fancy ceremonial titles. These princes commanded real provincial armies and actual treasuries. To stop the very usurpation his own family had just committed, Sima Ying armed his relatives with real military power, basically planting the exact explosive that would blow his dynasty to pieces.
Which brings us to a stark, really devastating number, 16. With an incredibly weak emperor on the throne and dozens of highly armed, super ambitious uncles and cousins surrounding him, an explosion was basically inevitable. For 16 brutal years, these princes fought each other to control the helpless Emperor Hui. This incredibly destructive civil conflict went down in history as the War of the Eight Princes.
And look, this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill war of succession. The sheer brutality of it practically guaranteed a total collapse. Over those 16 years of constant infighting, 6 of the 8 main princes met incredibly violent ends. They were either killed in battle or executed by whichever cousin happened to outlast them that week. And Emperor Hui himself, the guy was dragged around as a political pawn between 3 different cities like a piece of luggage, until he was finally poisoned. It was historically linked to a tainted cake of all things. It's essentially a systematic collective suicide of the ruling class. They left their own dynasty with literally nothing left to burn. Now, while the elites are busy destroying themselves, a brand new figure steps onto the board. Enter Liu Yuan. He was a Xiongnu noble sent to the capital of Luoyang as a hostage when he was young. He grew up there, got deeply educated in the Chinese classics, and was genuinely hungry for the acceptance of the civilization he'd grown up in. But the real tragedy of Liu Yuan is that he was permanently locked out of the inner circle. Court officials were constantly whispering that he was inherently disloyal just because of his heritage, blocking him from ever truly integrating.
Liu Yuan was completely, acutely aware of this suspicion. He even privately confessed to his friends, "I'm afraid that I'll die unjustly here in Luoyang." It's a fascinating psychological dynamic, right? You have this highly capable, highly educated guy who realizes the system is never, ever going to accept him. So what does he do? He waits. He waits for an opportunity to not just survive, but thrive. And that moment finally came knocking in the year 304, courtesy of the exact same princes who were busy tearing the empire apart. In an act of just pure desperation, one of the surviving princes, Sima Ying, desperately needed troops to win the civil war. So, he makes a fateful call. He invites Liu Yuan and his Xiongnu soldiers in to tip the scales. Sima Ying really thought he was just hiring a mercenary, but Liu Yuan had way bigger plans. Refusing to just be a hired gun for a crumbling dynasty, he seized the chaos and declared himself king of his own state in 304, pointedly naming it Han. Eventually, his forces marched right in and breached the capital of Chang'an. By trying to win an internal squabble,
Sima Ying didn't gain an ally. He literally invited in the dynasty's gravedigger.
The fallout from this massive miscalculation was catastrophic. Historians call it the disaster of Yongye. While the princes were busy playing their deadly Game of Thrones, the true cost was paid by everyday people. Extreme famine completely ravaged the land, the old capital was destroyed, and the ruling class was nearly erased down to the root. And the ultimate bitter irony here? The captive Jin emperor was forced by Liu Yuan's successor to serve wine at the banquet. It was a deliberate, humiliating display of subjugation, just days before he too was poisoned. Just like that, the Western Jin dynasty, completely hollowed out from the inside, was gone.
All right, now let's zoom out and pan across Eurasia, because what's absolutely fascinating is that this structural failure wasn't just some isolated fluke. If we look at the late Roman Empire, we see an almost identical structural flaw at play. Sima Ying's enfeudement of armed princes in China perfectly, and I mean perfectly, mirrors Rome's reliance on what was known as the foederati system.
So what exactly was this system? Well, the foederati were allied Germanic troops. Rome essentially outsourced its defense to them, offering up land and autonomy in exchange for military service. At first glance, it seemed like a brilliant bargain. Rome didn't have to raise or pay for its own native armies anymore. But the fatal flaw is exactly the same as we saw in the Jin dynasty. Rome handed real, on-the-ground military power to groups whose loyalty ran primarily to their own small communities and chieftains, rather than to the unified Roman state.
The long-term consequences of the shift are profound. Economically, sure, it was much cheaper in the short term to just hire out border defense. But over time, it critically undermined the loyalty and political security of the entire empire. Just think about what this actually means. When a civilization stops relying on its own citizens for defense and just outsources it to localized factions, it completely hollows out the very foundation of its own power. You are effectively paying someone else to hold a sword at your own neck.
And how do you think the Roman elites reacted to this shifting landscape? While the Jin dynasty elites were slaughtering each other in a civil war, late Rome's elites took a different but equally destructive path. They just checked out. A lot of wealthy Romans retreated to their massive, legally protected private estates, or villas, totally ignoring the mounting crises of the state. Others redirected all their energy to the newly ascending Christian church, focusing entirely on salvation in the next world rather than, saving this one. The end result? The public business of the empire was completely abandoned. State defense was left entirely in the hands of Germanic generals, creating this massive, fatal power vacuum right at the heart of Rome.
When we actually put these timelines side by side, the reflection is stunning. It is a brutal mirror image happening at opposite ends of the classical world. In 304, Liu Yuan, the invited outsider, declares his own state, and by 316 the Jin capital falls. Fast forward just a century in Rome, the Visigoth king Alaric, who is a former Roman allied commander, sacks the city of Rome in 410. And finally, in 476, the Germanic general Odoacer quietly deposes the final Western Roman emperor, who was literally just a child. Odoacer didn't even bother taking the imperial title for himself. He just boxed up the imperial regalia and shipped it away. The Western Roman Empire didn't explode in some massive final battle. It just quietly stopped.
Ultimately, neither of these magnificent civilizations was conquered by some massive, unified external enemy crashing over the gates. Both of them were hollowed out from the inside. They handed their power to proxies, fought bitter internal battles, and just checked out of their civic duties. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question. When a ruling elite stops believing in and stops paying the cost of their civilization's survival, who are they inviting in to take their place? It's a really sobering thought about how great structures actually collapse, not from outside force, but by invitation from within. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it gave you a completely new perspective on how history's greatest empires really fall.